Have you ever had to pay a ridiculous amount for a prescription drug and thought, how is this even legal? But then things get even weirder when this same drug costs a fraction of the price a few years later. So what changed? Did it suddenly become cheaper to make? Do less people need the drug? Not really. The answer is something called market exclusivity, and in this video, we're going to explore why this protection exists, if it's still working as intended, and ultimately, are we paying more than we should in order to encourage medical innovation? So what is market exclusivity? Well, think of it like this. Imagine you've spent 5 years writing a best-selling novel. You hire the editors, you pay the designers, you spend millions marketing it. Then on release day, someone photocopies your book, changes the cover, and starts selling it for half the price. Most people would buy the cheaper copy, which means you might never earn back what you invested. And if that kept happening, you'd probably stop writing books altogether. That's essentially the problem pharmaceutical companies argue they face, because developing a new drug often takes 10 to 15 years of research, thousands of failed experiments, multiple phases of clinical trials, and between several hundreds of millions of dollars to a couple of billions of dollars spent before a single patient ever fills a prescription. So when a company finally discovers a treatment that works, the FDA gives them something called market exclusivity. Think of it as a temporary no-copy period. For a limited number of years, competitors generally can't sell a generic or biosimilar versions of that same medicine. Depending on that type of drug, the protection can last anywhere up to 12 years. And at first glance, this sounds terrible for you and I, because fewer competitors usually means higher prices. So why did the FDA allow it? Because the goal isn't just to lower prices. It's also to make sure companies have a reason to keep inventing the next breakthrough treatment. Without some period to recover those enormous investments, many companies wouldn't take the financial risk of developing new drugs in the first place. So market exclusivity is really a balancing act that lowers prices through competition and stimulates innovation by creating treatments that didn't exist before. The challenge is figuring out where that balance should be. Now, here's the interesting part. Market exclusivity wasn't created to give pharmaceutical companies more power. In many ways, it was created to solve a different problem. Before the 1980s, getting a generic drug approved was almost as difficult as getting the original brand name drug approved. Even if everyone already knew the medicine worked, generic manufacturers often had to repeat expensive clinical studies. That meant years of extra work, higher costs, and fewer generic drugs ever making it to market. Meanwhile, brand name companies were finding ways to stretch out patent protection, delaying competition even longer. So consumers weren't getting cheaper drugs quickly, and genetic manufacturers were stuck repeating research that had already been done. That's when Congress decided there had to be a better system. So in 1984, it passed the Hatch-Waxman Act. And the idea seemed fair. Brand name companies making small molecule drugs, mostly pills, would receive periods of market exclusivity, giving them enough time to earn back their investment. And today's market exclusivities for small molecule drugs generally last between 3 and 7 years, depending on the type of drug. In exchange, generic manufacturers would get a much faster approval process once that exclusivity ended. So instead of repeating years of clinical trials, they could show that their drug was bioequivalent to the original medicine, and that dramatically reduced development costs, which is why generic drugs can often be sold at much less than the original brand name version. But then a new challenge came along. Some of today's most important and most expensive medicines are biologics. These are much larger and more complex drugs than covered under the Hatch-Waxman Act, and they're made from living cells. Think cancer immunotherapies, blood products, and vaccines. So in 2010, Congress created a separate pathway for these drugs through the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act. Instead of generics, these medicines have biosimilars, which are products that are highly similar to the original biologic. And these biologic drugs receive 12 years of market exclusivity before biosimilar competition can generally enter the market. Now, if you've ever heard of patents, you might be wondering, what's the difference between that and market exclusivity? A patent is a property right that protects the invention itself, whereas market exclusivity is a period of time where the FDA blocks the approval of generics or biosimilars. You can obtain a patent at any time, even before the drug is approved. But you can only get market exclusivity if the drug is approved. While they often work in parallel to limit competition, they are separate forms of protection. So on paper, this system makes a lot of sense. Companies earn enough to keep innovating, patients eventually get lower cost generics, and society gets new medicines that save lives. It's a compromise, but every compromise raises the same question. Is one side getting a better deal than the other? Because while pharmaceutical companies often point to the billions it costs to bring a drug to market, patients are standing at the pharmacy counter wondering why their medications cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. And here's what we've seen over the last few decades. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, prescription drug prices have risen 3 times as fast as overall inflation since 1985. And the drugs hit the hardest are those targeting heart disease. You know, the leading cause of death in the US. In fact, a cardiovascular drug that costs $100 in January of 2002 would cost about $455 today. So it's not just that drugs are getting more expensive. They're getting more expensive much faster than the things we buy every day. And while we typically think of pharmacy benefit managers and insurance companies as the villains in this story, the prices they negotiate and the prices you pay start with the list price set by the pharmaceutical companies. And that price is influenced by what the market will pay, the same market that gives them years of monopoly before generics can compete. And here's the impact of competition. According to a Department of Health and Human Services study on the effect of competition on generic drug prices from 2007 to 2022, drug prices fall the more generics are available. Prices declined 20% in markets with 3 competitors and about 70 to 80% in markets with 10 or more competitors 3 years after the first generic entered the market. In other words, when competition arrives, prices fall dramatically, and we can see what actually happens when the monopoly ends. Listen, nobody expects pharmaceutical companies to work for free. But at what point have we moved beyond encouraging innovation and simply into protecting profits? Because pharmaceutical companies aren't just profitable, they're amongst the most profitable industries, period. A 2020 Journal of the American Medical Association study comparing the profitability of large pharmaceutical companies in the S&P 500 with other large companies in the same index found that from 2000 to 2018, 35 large pharmaceutical companies had a 13.8% profit margin compared to 7.7% for 357 non-pharmaceutical companies. So yes, developing drugs is expensive, but the industry is also exceptionally profitable, and pharmaceutical companies will often point to the high cost of developing drugs to explain why. But here's where things get interesting. A 2025 study from RAND looked at the cost of developing 38 drugs approved by the FDA in 2019, and they found something important. The median cost of developing a drug was about $708 million, but the average was $1.3 billion. And if you've ever taken a statistics class, you know that averages are greatly affected by outliers. And that's exactly what they found. A handful of extremely expensive drugs were pulling the averages up, and removing just 2 of these lowered the drug average by 26% from $1.3 billion to $950 million. So when we hear that it costs over $1 billion to develop a drug, we have to ask, is that the cost of developing the typical drug? And that matters because the entire justification for market exclusivity rests on the deal that we give pharmaceutical companies years without competition so that they have a chance to make enough money from a new drug to make all the time, money, and risk of developing it worth it. But here's another plot twist. What if lowering drug prices doesn't actually discourage companies from developing new drugs? The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that policies designed to reduce Medicare drug prices would reduce the number of new drugs by about 1% over 30 years. Now, that's not 0%, but it's also nowhere near the dramatic collapse in innovation you might expect if prices were to drop. So maybe the choice isn't high drug prices or no innovation. Maybe there's a middle ground. A system where pharmaceutical companies can make enough to justify the cost of drug development, but without giving them so much protection that patients end up paying unnecessarily high prices for years. Because every extra year without competition has a cost. Someone skips a dose. Someone delays starting treatment. Someone splits pills or never fills their prescription in the first place because they just can't afford it. Hey, I'm Shami. I'm a healthcare finance consultant, and I like teaching you about the business side of healthcare so you can stay insured and informed. Please like, subscribe, and comment below. And thank you so much for watching.